You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations Live. I'm Osman Butt. My guest today is Ayşe Zarakol. She is a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at Emmanuel College. Her research is at the intersection of IR and historical sociology, focusing on East-West relations in the international system, the history and the future of the world order, conceptualization of modernity and sovereignty, rising and declining powers, and Turkish politics in comparative perspective. She is the author of After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West, which was Cambridge University Press 2011, which deals with international stigmatization and the integration and defeat of non-Western powers, Turkey after World War I, Japan after World War II, and Russia after the Cold War, into the international system, and is the editor of the prize-winning Hierarchies in World Politics, Cambridge University Press 2017. Her articles have appeared in journals such as the International Organization of International Theory, International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Relations, Review of International Studies, among others. Her new book, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which advances an alternative global history of the world order for IR, was published in March 2022 by Cambridge University Press. Ayşe, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And it's our pleasure to have you. So I want to get right in and talk about your latest book, which I believe, as I said, came out in March this year. Mm-hmm. In your sort of book, you sort of explore the idea of history of international politics that doesn't begin with the West, right? So we have this sort of narrative around, and I was an IR student many years ago, many years ago, and we were told this sort of narrative about the rise of international politics, and it sort of begins in the 1640s, when you get these series of treaties called the Treaty of Westphalia, series of treaties where the New World Order is sort of established, where the Vatican isn't invited, and this is the birth of world order. But what you've sort of done is you've gone back further than this to sort of think about what international order looks like, right? So our sort of conventional narrative is the rise of the West and the decline of the East. Could you perhaps explain to us why exploring this topic was important to you and what its what the significance is?
Thank you. So, as you said, there is kind of a streamlined history of international relations that students are still taught, which is that international order making started in Europe in the 17th century. After the 30 Years' War, with the Peace of Westphalia, this is when Europeans created their regional order, and then this order was exported to the rest of the world. The story goes, and then not much is said about what was happening in the rest of the world in this account until Europeans come and take over. But students, I think, just because they're not taught any non-European history, assume that the rest of the world was disconnected, didn't really have international relations. I mean, we do kind of know of Asian empires, but we don't know much about their relations. It's almost as if they only engaged, in wars and nothing else. So I wanted to challenge that traditional account, and I also wanted to write a history of, the space we call Asia today, that did not center European actors. And I really wanted to show how Asian, we're broadly defined. So my use of the word Asia includes, the Middle East, it includes Russia, all of that. I want to show how these people who lived in these areas related to each other before Europe, before the West. Yeah.
Yes, and you sort of you choose to, because there's a number of different ways you could have looked at this, right? I mean, we've had some research, in the last few years where international relations scholars are seriously considering what did pre-Western world order look like? You've got this one book on the East Asian system, which I can't remember who the author is, but he was looking at the Chinese tribute system as a form of world order in East Asia. But in your particular book, you choose to focus on the Mongols and their international-led order. Could you perhaps tell us about the Mongol Empire? What did it really look like? And how did it differ from our present Western-led order?
Thank you. So there have been, as you say, some accounts of, bringing China in, writing histories of East Asia, which are improvements, on the existing narrative. But I still wanted, it was hard for me as a student of international history to know how different parts of Asia related to each other. So when you just bring in Chinese history, it's hard to know how it lines up with the European history we know, or, what was happening in the Ottoman Empire or the Middle East when X was happening in China. So I want to write a connected history of this space rather than focus on one particular region or one particular national history. And that desire to write a connected history is what took me back to the Mongols. I'm originally from Turkey, so people may think there is some kind of Turco-Mongol connection or something, but it's not. That was not my motivation. And in fact, I have a chapter in the book at the end, in the epilogue, where I, talk about the politics of writing such an account. But I ended up with the Mongol Empire because the Mongol Empire in the 13th century plays a similar role, unifying role for Asia that for Roman Empire played for Europe. So it's a moment where much of the continent comes under the rule of the same sovereign, same institutions, same laws, because the Great Khan was also a lawgiver, unusually, and then we can kind of trace the effects of those shared institutions, understandings of sovereignty in the successor states and empires. So I thought that would be a good place to start a connected account of Asia, and then we can see how these ideas diffused in the rest of the continent, both in the regions that were controlled by the empire, or their but also their successor states. Yeah.
They have because I think the Mongols their extended influence is actually quite an interesting thing to think about, because we're not just talking about the Mongols, who they directly ruled. We're talking about the successor states that were born out of them. You can think about modern Ukraine, you can think about many states like Russia, and all of these countries are, Iran to a large extent too, like these post-Mongol states.
Yeah. So and for a long time, they were dismissed. There was this idea that the Mongols, they're just this Mongol horde, just destruction and nothing else. And I don't want to display the violence. Clearly, there was a lot of brutality in the creation of this empire, but at the same time, it is a mode of governance, that is not entirely fleeting. We're talking about more than a century. So that's longer than most nation states, which we, shape our present day lives. A particular mode of governance, which in the book I call Chingizid sovereignty. So it's like a very centralized type of rule, at least in theory, which is legitimized by world conquest. So there's the expectation that the ruler is all powerful, makes all the laws, doesn't answer to any other authority, religious and whatnot. At the same time, he has to be a world conqueror. And, they had extensive trade networks, this postal service spanning, they moved people around or across Asia. So they created, they had quite lasting effects beyond the initial conquest. So in successor states that were, ruled by the Mongols, we see also increased centralization. We see an, interest in facilitation of trade. There are a number of secondary institutions that are clearly influenced by this Mongol period, and we can trace this for decades, and in some places, in some regions of Asia, for centuries to come.
But how did this sort of world order differ from, say, the one that would develop in Europe? Is there a distinct difference between them?
Yeah, so of course they are different. We're talking about different time periods. So in the book, I'm looking at 13th to 17th century, really. And the reason why I say this is, these were world orders similar to, the modern international order is that there's kind of a universalism to them, because they were trying to create world empires, these Mongol influenced sovereigns, they ended up creating orders that spanned much of the known world at the time. And in the beginning, you have the Mongol Empire that's spanning much of what we call Asia. And then, the successors, the Timurids and the early Ming, and then the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and so on. It's, much of the known world. What's similar is, I think, a particular understanding of, centralized sovereignty. But of course, the modern international order is based on nation states. So it's it's the nation states that are sovereign rather than, individuals. Whereas in this world, you have, the great rulers. And what's also similar is like this claim to universality, which the modern international order also has. But what's different is, it's based on empire rather than, again, nation states. So some things that are recognizable to modern international relations and some things that are rather different. But I think still helpful to think with if we're thinking about, creation of world orders or their decline or, how they're replaced and, what kind of crises they may encounter.
Yes, and I think because I think one of the things we need to sort of appreciate about the modern international order is that it's a sort of thing that was created out of the legacy of European empires, the modern one that is. And so a lot of the cultural norms of Europe become international norms, right? So questions around international law, human rights, particularly the conceptualization of human rights as being in the body of an individual as opposed to a collective group of people, and so on. So there's a kind of, on the one hand, you have a hierarchy which says all nation states are equal. So equality is a huge part of international system, but there's also this implied understanding that there should be individual rights within the international orders today. So I'm sort of wondering whether something similar existed in the Mongol world order.
Well, I mean, it wasn't so our order plays at least lip service to the idea of sovereign equality. As you said, nation states are supposed to be equal. The notion of individual rights, you don't really have that in the orders that I'm looking at. It's really very hierarchical, and the hierarchy is you have the great ruler and his house or his dynasty, great houses, and then you have secondary houses of I guess the equivalent of aristocrats, and then everybody else is hardly has more rights than cattle. They're like people living on the land, and cannon fodder, or just people working the land, or and so on. So the idea of citizenship or people having rights doesn't really exist in this world. At the same time, the Mongols and those who are influenced by them, Chinggis style sovereigns, because they saw themselves as above society, because they had such a hierarchical vision of the world, they left people after the conquests. In general, they didn't really meddle that much in the practice of everyday life, or practice of religion. These tend to be, the empires that I'm looking at tend to be very maybe pluralist is not the right word, because in the sense, they're not actively promoting cultural diversity, but at the same time they're more tolerant than their European counterparts. You don't have the equivalent of Inquisition or anything like that, because they think they're above it all. Even when they end up converting to Islam or others, they have a generally tolerant attitude of other types of practices.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what the distinction people might draw between these empires and the European ones, which is European, so Mongol Empire is an imperial empire because it's expanding beyond its borders. But with Europe, it wasn't just imperialism, it was colonization as well, which is not essentially this idea that we can not just take a society, but remake it as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think that difference, there is something different about like the European trajectory there. I mean, it's ironic now because, it's now the West claims tolerance and, the East is considered to be intolerant of difference. And maybe, that's been maybe generally true in the 20th century, but historically speaking, it was Europe that was generally very intolerant of difference, policing belief. I think partly because they were very peripheral to these larger Asian world orders, kind of this place at the edge of these larger trade networks and so on. So that intolerance then translated to a different kind of empire making later on, I think, when they became powerful.
So moving on then from that to the question of the Ottoman Empire, right? So often, obviously, Ottoman Empire is dealt with by historians, but I was also thinking about this the other day, that the Ottoman Empire is also key to the formation of global politics. And, you can't really understand the development of European empires without understanding the development of the Ottoman Empire. But I'm sort of wondering, what do international relations scholars, as opposed to, say, historians, what do they actually think about the Ottoman contribution to the development of a Western-led international order?
Yeah. I mean, for a long time, the Ottoman Empire was not really part of international relations discussions. We've been trying to change that because I do think it plays a very important role. And I do have a chapter in this book, in this last book, talking about the influences of the East on the West. And one of the main links is, the Ottoman Empire, because if we think of only European history, then the Ottoman Empire looks like this peripheral empire at the edges of Europe, and is trying to, gain belonging in Europe. I mean, that's the kind of the traditional account, but that's actually projecting late 19th, 20th century dynamics into history. In my account, the Ottoman Empire is part of a much larger world in Asia, part of a larger tradition of order building and empire building in Asia. And, in the 16th century, the Ottomans are competing with the Safavids and the Mughals. And it's really, that's their orientation is not necessarily to the West. I mean, they do care about what's happening in Europe. They're competing with the Habsburgs, but they're also very much competing with these Asian empires who are also claiming universal sovereignty and millennial sovereignty. And, between the Ottomans, the Safavids and the Mughals, and add the Uzbeks, these Islamic/Chingizid empires control much of the world's population, the economy. So it's, 16th century, the world is not centered in Europe. It's really centered in West Asia. And it's the Europeans who are trying to hook into that larger order. There's, the Portuguese and so on, they're already kind of made their way, the Italian merchants. And the Habsburgs are trying to compete with the Ottomans. They're learning things from the Ottomans. So the European trajectory makes no sense without this larger picture. For the longest time, we've left out the real story and we focused on, kind of the B plot when we study the 16th century. So the argument there that I make, which hopefully will become generally accepted in international relations, that we can't understand what's happening in Europe in the 16th century and also later 17th century if we don't take into account what's happening in the rest of Eurasia.
So, because obviously you're one of these scholars trying to sort of bring in the Ottomans as well as others, how are these efforts being met? What has the reaction been inside international relations?
In general, I think there has been there's not been that much pushback. I mean, my first book was also about, it was 19th century onwards, but it also was using the Ottoman case together with Russia and Japan to make the argument that, international relations is not what it's assumed to be. It's not just about material power. These historical social dynamics of recognition and acceptance, have cast long shadows about stigmatization and so on. So I think in general, there is a growing acceptance that international relations needs to take into account histories of regions other than Europe, other than the West. I mean, there have also been many critiques saying, our international relations is very Eurocentric. But I think, it's not enough just to make the critique. I think we all now have to move on to the second stage. The critique has been heard. People are open to improving things, but we need to write, better accounts, better histories. So, my account is just partial. It focuses on, the Mongols and their, successor states. But there are other stories to be told in Asia, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, South America, and so on. So the more we can provide alternative accounts, I think the more successful we will be in challenging and maybe replacing these received wisdoms about how international relations has evolved and how it works today.
Yes, and for many states, so states in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the rise and imposition of a Western-led order was a radical break from the older orders that had previously governed these areas or international relations between them. And so many had to sort of readjust themselves. In, for example, the Turkish case, could you perhaps tell us how these changes impacted Turkey and what was this sort of Turkish experience in living with this new world order?
Thank you. So that's more the subject of my first book, which, as I said, deals with, the incorporation of non-Western powers into a Western-led order. And there I draw attention to how those that did not conform to expectations that were derived from the European experience, the quote-unquote standard of civilization, as it was called in the 19th century, those essentially anybody who was not European was considered less than civilized. These countries were stigmatized, and then the elites in these countries often internalized that story of stigmatization, and this is why we see these very radical projects of modernization or westernization or catching up with the West, with implications for many decades. I mean, to the present day, you could say modern nation state identities in much of the world, I mean, it's not just the cases I'm looking at, have been shaped by this experience of stigmatization and being considered less than civilized, less than normal, less than modern. So I think Turkey is a case where that's very acutely observable because of the particular trajectory of Turkey in the 20th century. Also having to do with the legacies of being the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, so having grander ambitions than maybe other states, and therefore feeling the sting of stigma even more than maybe some other places. So I would say that's what Turkey tells us. Yeah.
But Turkey is kind of an interesting experience because, as you said, it does have this Ottoman legacy, but it also sits with this sort of charge that people sort of throw at it, that it's either a pan-Turkic policy or it's a neo-Ottoman. They get all these charges thrown at them when it comes to their foreign relations. And when you sort of try to look at what Turkey's in practice trying to do around the world, it's nowhere near as ambitious as an Ottomanism, as it were. They're not physically trying to fully expand everywhere. There's trade, there's commerce, and some limited military involvement in places like Syria and so on. So I'm wondering, how has this translated at the sort of, could you just first of all comment on that first? Sorry.
Yes, I mean, so It's simultaneously two things. One, like Turkey has more capacity and more ambition, I think, in terms of foreign policy than it's given credit for, maybe from the outside. There are various projects in North Africa. I mean, this is a country that has its fingers in different pots. Maybe, as you say, not as ambitious as the Ottoman Empire, but it's still, I think, generally ambitious foreign policy-wise. At the same time, the ambition often outstrips capacity. I mean, that's also true. So it's, I mean, what I'm trying to say is it's discounted maybe internationally for the reasons I discussed in my first book. At the same time, leaders in Turkey often maybe imagine the country, or maybe generally the population imagine the country to be more important than it is. So I think simultaneously both things are true. What was your second question? You had a second question.
Yes, so I just wanted to sort of get into what does this translate into when it comes to actual policy, though?
Actually, I mean, right now it's more about the survival of the regime. So it's hard to say what's Turkish foreign policy and what's Erdogan's foreign policy. I mean, if we're talking about what's happening now with relation to Ukraine, etc., it's more about short-term choices made in order to prolong regime survival. So that's why Turkey has been engaged in this kind of balancing act between the West and Russia, because there are also complicated financial calculations given the state of the economy. But I think, I mean, in the long term, if we can separate Turkish foreign policy from Erdogan's personal calculations, I think this straddling situation maybe is more durable, because it's more, I mean, that's the story in my last book, right? Turkey is not just on the periphery of Europe. It's always been, this is a region. I mean, it's not just Turkey either. This is a region that's always kind of straddled, Asian orders with, European orders. So I think it's only returned to form that, some of that obsession with with the West has been replaced by trying other alternatives. So I think that may be something more durable.
So I now want to turn to the fact that you've got obviously Turkish scholars, academics, and policymakers. I'm sort of wanted to know now what is their thinking about the future of Turkish foreign policy, especially Turkey's role in the international system, right? Because supposedly we're living through a time of transformation away from unipolar to multipolar, possibly. But I'm sort of just wondering, what does the debate look like in Turkey about its future role in the international system?
I'm not sure there is such a big debate in the Turkish scholarly community. I mean, there should be, I agree, but Turkey has entered. You could say the whole world is going through tumultuous times, but Turkey started encountering this rough patch maybe earlier than some other places. So for the last decade or so, I would say the scholarly community has been more focused on Turkish domestic politics, and foreign policies kind of filtered through that lens, like in terms of its implications for Turkish domestic politics. And there isn't that, in the larger scholarly community, that, big debate. Among scholars who are closer to the regime, of course, there is this, there are claims about, a Turkish century and, this and that. But in some ways, they're, echoing what the regime says. I don't know. I mean, I think elections next year may give us more clarity as to what the next decade will look like, depending on, whether there are elections and, what the outcome is. Yeah.
So I'll make this the last question, and then so I'm sort of, because you spoke about when you sort of came to the West, you came and you started studying international relations, and we've talked a little bit about the Turkish experience at sort of the collective level of trying to adjust. But I'm sort of wondering, what does, thinking about you personally or other Turks who come to study international relations, what was that experience like when you're having to go through learning about this Western-led order through these sorts of theories, and how it sort of comes up against what maybe you sort of see around you or have experienced?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's a great question, and perhaps I could turn it into a piece of advice for more junior scholars. I mean, I started studying in the West at the university level, so I was very young, and in the beginning, I encountered these historical accounts that had no acknowledgement of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, any of that. And so initially my thought was, these accounts leave out these parts of the world because maybe these parts of the world are not important. But as I matured, I started thinking, maybe the accounts themselves are wrong. And maybe I have something to offer, if I could only improve the accounts using the knowledge that I have access to. So that's what I would recommend to everyone. Instead of taking, the orthodoxy for granted or assuming that it must be there for a good reason, I think we all have something to contribute. And hopefully others will join this larger enterprise of globalizing IR and also maybe other social sciences because they really need it.
Professor Zarakol, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for another MEMO Conversations Live.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.